Part 1 draft. The community center was already full when a quiet woman stepped through the double doors, holding an old music folder against her chest. She entered slowly, almost as if she didn't want to disturb anyone, though no one paid enough attention to notice her presence anyway. The recital had been advertised as an open event, welcoming anyone willing to perform. But the crowd mostly consisted of young students, proud parents, and a handful of polished musicians who clearly knew one another. The woman, who introduced herself earlier only as Lena when she signed the attendance sheet, walked with a gentle posture, her shoulders slightly bent from years of carrying bags, groceries, and the weight of a life that never paused long enough for her to think of herself. She looked around for an empty seat, but the rows closest to the stage were already filled with excited families. So she quietly moved toward the back, choosing a lonely chair near the wall. She placed her old folder on her lap and began smoothing its edges. The cover had faded from deep blue to a dull gray over time, and the corners were soft from years of use. Anyone who saw it would assume she was a beginner, or maybe someone who practiced casually. They would never guess how much that folder meant to her. It held pieces she had played long ago, melodies she once loved, and a few notes she had scribbled down during moments when music was the only escape she had. A group of teenagers laughed nearby as they prepared for their turn. Their polished shoes, neatly pressed clothes, and confident chatter almost made the room feel like a competition rather than a friendly showcase. Lena listened to them, not out of curiosity, but because their voices were energetic and impossible to ignore. One of them noticed her and nudged his friend, whispering something. The friend shrugged, barely interested, and they returned to tuning their instruments. It wasn't the first time Lena had been overlooked, and she had stopped expecting anything different. She never dressed to impress, never talked about herself, and certainly never tried to stand out. Yet despite her very quiet presence, her mind still held memories of stages much larger than this one stages where she once played confidently under bright lights, back when life seemed full of possibility. But those days faded over time, replaced by responsibilities that demanded everything she had. The recital had already begun, and a young girl in a silver dress sat at the piano, lifting her hands with determination. The first notes rang out, bright and clean. The audience leaned forward, smiling. Parents recorded on their phones. The girl played with the kind of confidence that comes from being encouraged every step of the way. Lena watched with a soft smile, admiring the girl's courage. Even though she was sitting in the back, far away from the crowd, she felt the music pass through her like a small reminder of why she had come. She didn't know exactly what had pushed her to sign up for this recital. Maybe it was the feeling she had carried for years, the quiet ache of something unfinished. For a long time, she had convinced herself that performing was part of a life she had left behind. But recently, she found herself missing the sound of the piano under her fingers, missing the comfort it once brought her. So when she saw a flyer posted at the grocery store, inviting local residents to share their talents, she hesitated for only a moment before writing her name. Now, sitting there among strangers, she wondered if she had made a mistake. Her hands were warm with nervousness, and she was suddenly aware of how long it had been since she had performed in front of others. She opened her folder slowly, letting her eyes follow the worn lines of the sheet music. Some of the notes were handwritten, tilted slightly from the rushed moments she had written them years ago. She traced her finger along them, remembering the feelings behind each stroke of the pen. Lena watched performer after performer go up to the stage. Each one had their own unique way of approaching the piano, some nervous, some bold, some playful. The crowd clapped for everyone, though the applause was louder for the well-dressed students whose families filled the first few rows. No one clapped more softly for Lena. No one clapped for her at all. She hadn't gone up yet. A man reading the program made a small comment to the woman beside him. Number 23? I don't recognize that name, he said casually. Probably a new student. She replied without much interest. They didn't know he was. Talking about Lina, and she would not have corrected them, even if. She had heard clearly. She preferred it this way, quiet, unnoticed. Or at least she told herself that the host of the event, stood at the front with a cheerful smile. We're so happy to have a full lineup tonight, she said. We have beginners, advanced musicians, and a few special surprises. Lina wondered which category she belonged to now. Beginner? No? Advanced? She wasn't sure she deserved that anymore. And she certainly wasn't a surprise. No one even noticed she was there. As the evening went on, the room grew warmer. A scent of polished wood and faint perfume filled the air. Lights from the stage cast soft reflections on the piano's surface. Participants moved in and out of the backstage area, checking their sheet music, whispering last-minute reminders to themselves. Meanwhile, Lina remained still. She listened to each performance with care, admiring the courage it took for every person to walk to that piano. She clapped for them, even when others didn't. In her mind, she understood what it meant to feel scared, excited, uncertain all at once. A boy stumbled during his piece, hitting a wrong note so loudly that the audience winced. But Lina smiled gently, recognizing the panic that quickly spread across his face. She had felt that before many times. The boy tried to recover and finish the piece, but when he stood to bow, his shoulders sagged as if he had disappointed everyone. As he passed by the back row, Lina whispered quietly, "You did well. You kept going." The boy looked at her, surprised, then nodded softly. No one else had noticed her words, but that small exchange made her heart settle a bit. Maybe it wasn't so terrible being invisible sometimes. Sometimes it let her comfort someone else without drawing attention. The host's voice broke her thoughts. Up next, we have number 23, she said, glancing at the list. Lina, the room didn't react. No whispers of recognition, no turning heads. But that was fine. Lina took a slow breath, stood up, and smoothed her clothes. She felt the old familiar flutter in her stomach. The same flutter she used to feel long ago, before a performance fear mixed with something softer. Almost like hope. She walked toward the stage, each step quiet but steady. The crowd continued talking among themselves. A few people checked their phones. Some were preparing to leave, thinking the event was nearly over. No one expected anything from her. But as she reached the small staircase leading up to the stage, she paused. Her fingers tightened around her folder. She wasn't the same person she had been when she last performed. She didn't have the same confidence, the same youthful energy. What she had now was different, quieter, deeper. She climbed the steps and approached the piano. The seat felt firm beneath her as she sat down, adjusting her position carefully. She placed her music on the stand, smoothing the pages the way she always did. Then she let her hands rest on her lap for a moment, breathing slowly as she looked at the keys. The room was still filled with chatter, but she didn't mind. She let her mind empty, allowing the familiar weight of music to settle inside her. She had chosen a piece she knew well, one she had played countless times alone in her small living room. She didn't know if the audience would care. She wasn't sure if the judges would find it impressive. But she felt something pull her forward, something that whispered that it was time. Before she played a single note, she closed her eyes for a brief moment, remembering the younger version of herself, the girl who once dreamed of stages, competitions, distant travel. That girl had disappeared over the years, buried beneath responsibilities, long work hours, and quiet sacrifices. Now, for a moment, she felt close to her again. Lina opened her eyes, lifted her hands, and prepared to play. Part 2. The soft hum of chatter continued around the room as Lina sat at the piano, preparing to gather her thoughts. But part two does not begin on the stage. It begins years earlier, long before this recital, when her days were filled with music and her life looked completely different. Back then, Lina was a young woman with a quiet but steady confidence. She spent most of her time in small practice rooms, the kind with thin walls and a faint echo that only musicians noticed. She wasn't loud or boastful, but people around her often recognized her dedication. They noticed how she stayed long after others left, how she practiced until her arms felt heavy, and how she took every small mistake as a reason to go deeper into the music. Her teacher in those days used to say, "Your hands speak before you do." And it was true. Lina didn't talk much, but her playing revealed everything: her kindness, her patience, and the gentle strength she carried. When she was younger, she dreamed of becoming a performer who would travel, compete, or play for large audiences. But her dreams were not made of fame or applause. She simply wanted to share something beautiful, something honest. Music felt like a language she could trust, one that never judged her and always welcomed her. But life, as it often does, changed her path. The first change came quietly, almost without warning. Her mother fell ill, slowly losing the strength she once had. Lina became her main caregiver. At first, she tried to balance both worlds: daytime lessons, evening practice, and late nights helping her mother. But soon the balance broke. There were moments when she had to skip rehearsals. Then she began missing small performances. Eventually, she had to give up an opportunity she had waited years for. She remembered packing her sheet music away one night, placing her polished shoes inside a box, and pushing it under her bed. She told herself it was temporary, that one day she would return to the same stage with more strength. But temporary became months, months became years, and years became something heavier. That it wasn't only responsibility that changed her. Life outside music was not easy. She took jobs wherever she could: cleaning, helping at shops, caring for children whose parents worked long hours. She worked for kindness, not success. She lived simply, never asking for more than she needed. But every time she walked past a piano, she felt a small tug in her chest, like a memory trying to remind her of who she used to be. After her mother passed, the house became quiet in a way she wasn't prepared for. She spent nights sitting alone, listening to old recordings of piano pieces she once knew by heart. Some nights she cried without making a sound. Other nights she tried to play again, but her fingers were stiff, her confidence shaky. She felt like she had stepped away for too long. She told herself it was too late to return, too late to learn again, too late to stand on a stage. But something inside her refused to let go completely. When she moved to a new town, she found a small community center with a piano that anyone could play if they asked. The piano wasn't fancy. The keys were slightly uneven in color, and the pedals squeaked. But the first time she touched it, she felt something familiar, a softness, a warmth. Her fingers didn't move as fast as before, but they remembered the shapes. They remembered the chords. They remembered her. She began visiting once a week, then twice, then as often as her schedule allowed. She played in the early mornings when no one else was around. The janitor sometimes listened from the hallway without telling her. He didn't know her story, but he sensed something in her music, something honest. For months, Lina played only for herself. She had no intention of performing publicly again. But one rainy afternoon, while stopping at a grocery store, something caught her eye. A colorful flyer on the bulletin board read, "Community Recital, all skill levels welcome. Share your music." She stared at it longer than she expected. The words "all skill levels" made her hesitate. She didn't know where she belonged anymore. She wasn't a beginner. She wasn't advanced. She was someone who had loved something deeply, stepped away, and slowly found her way back. She took a photo of the flyer, but didn't decide immediately. For a week, she debated with herself. One moment she thought she could do it. The next moment she argued that no one would care, that she didn't belong on a stage filled with younger, more polished performers. But something pushed her, maybe the memory of her mother encouraging her, maybe the quiet ache she felt whenever she imagined never trying again. Whatever it was, she found herself writing her name on the sign-up sheet. She used only her first name. She didn't list any past accomplishments. She didn't explain where she came from or why she was performing. She simply wrote her name, took a breath, and walked away before she could change her mind. Now, sitting in the recital hall, she thought about all those years she had stepped away. She wondered if her life would have been different if she had continued. But then she reminded herself that she had done what she had to do. She had lived with honesty, even when it meant giving up parts of herself. Her thoughts drifted back to the people around her. She watched children practicing their finger positions in the air. She watched proud parents adjusting cameras. She watched musicians discussing techniques she once knew but had forgotten. All of it reminded her of the world she had left and was now returning to, even if just for one night. She didn't envy them. She didn't feel jealous of the younger performers or the confident ones. She felt something else, maybe gratitude for having the chance to be part of something again. While she waited for her turn, she thought back to specific memories. She remembered struggling to pay for her lessons. She remembered her teacher placing a soft hand on her shoulder after a difficult rehearsal, saying, "You don't need to be the loudest to be heard." She remembered performing in a small hall where only 10 people attended, yet she had felt like the whole world was listening. She remembered her mother sitting beside her afterward, her tired eyes shining with pride. She remembered everything, and the memories felt both close and far away, like a melody she once knew but had not played in a long time. But the most important memory was one she rarely talked about, the melody she wrote herself. It wasn't a complex piece. It wasn't meant for competitions or judges. She wrote it during a time when she felt overwhelmed, when life felt too heavy, and she didn't know how to express what she felt. The melody was gentle at first, almost fragile, then grew stronger, carrying the weight of everything she had been holding inside. She had never played that melody for anyone else. It was her hidden voice, her private confession. She kept it folded in her old music folder, tucked behind other sheets, as if it were too personal to reveal. But for this recital, she chose that piece. She chose it not because she wanted attention or applause, but because it represented everything she had lived through. And maybe, just maybe, someone in the audience would understand it. Or maybe no one would. But she wanted to play it because it was her true self. She thought about the judge, an older man known for his strict critiques. She noticed him earlier scanning the list with a small frown. When he saw her name, he didn't react with interest. He simply moved on. She understood why. She had no background listed, no achievements next to her name. She must have looked like someone who wandered in on a whim, but she didn't mind. She didn't need him to expect anything from her. Before long, the host announced that the recital was nearing its final performers. Lena felt her heartbeat quicken. She tried to calm herself by breathing deeply, the way she used to before important performances. When her number was called, she stood up slowly, feeling the familiar tremble in her legs. But this time, she wasn't afraid the way she had been in the past. The fear now felt softer, almost like excitement. As she made her way toward the stage, she felt the weight of her past walking with her, not as a burden, but as something that shaped her. She felt every hard moment, every quiet sacrifice, every memory of music she once loved. She also felt something else, a small but steady sense of purpose, that this was not about proving anything. It wasn't about being better than anyone else. It wasn't about being judged, that it was simply about sharing a part of herself she had kept hidden for too long. And that was enough. As she climbed the steps and sat down at the piano, the room around her continued its chatter. But inside her mind, everything fell silent. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys and closed her eyes for a brief moment, gathering all the strength she had left. The next moment would change everything. But for now, she sat in the quiet, ready to begin. Part 3 draft. The chatter in the recital hall slowly drifted around the room as Lena kept her hands resting gently on the piano keys. But this part of the story begins not with her fingers or the notes she was about to play. It begins with a man sitting only a few feet away from the stage. A man who had been observing the evening with critical eyes. Maestro Aldrin. The lead judge wasn't a cruel person, but he was known for his strictness. His standards were high. He often believed that only those who trained formally and dedicated their entire lives to music could create something meaningful. He was old-fashioned in that way. To him, skill came from discipline, and discipline came from years of structured study. Throughout the recital, he had been taking notes in a small leather-bound book. His handwriting was neat, even elegant. Every so often, he nodded slightly when a performer impressed him, or wrote short comments when something needed improvement. The other two judges sometimes glanced at him, hoping to read his reactions. He rarely revealed much, but when he first saw the name Lena on the performance list earlier that evening, he had paused. He searched for additional information: school affiliation, training background, teacher's name. There was nothing. Just the name. He sighed, quietly but noticeably. To him, it seemed like someone without guidance or preparation had simply wandered onto the list. He had judged many recitals before, and he could usually tell when a performer was doing it for fun, without understanding the seriousness of the art. He didn't look at her when she entered the stage. He was already writing something down. It wasn't unkind. It was simply a habit of thought, forming before he had even heard a single note. He wrote, unknown, possibly inexperienced. He had no idea how wrong he would be. As Lena settled on the piano bench, the room slowly began to shift. Not dramatically, no one gasped. No one suddenly fell silent. But there was something about the way she moved that caught a few quiet glances. She sat with calmness, the kind that didn't come from confidence, but from acceptance. Her clothes were simple, her hair loosely tied back, and her posture humble. She didn't fit the image of a polished performer who came to impress. She looked like someone who carried a long story behind her eyes, a story no one had asked about. Maestro Aldrin looked up briefly, then down again. In his mind, she was likely nervous and unprepared. He had judged many performers who came with shaky hands and uneven rhythms. He expected nothing unusual, but something he couldn't explain made him pause before returning to his notes. He noticed the way she touched the folder resting beside her, the way she smoothed the edges of the sheets as if they were more than paper. He noticed how she closed her eyes, not to remember the notes, but to gather something from within. He lifted his eyebrows slightly, but said nothing. Lena took a soft breath and let her hands rise above the keys. Her fingers curved gently, like she had done 1,000 times before. But before she played, she hesitated just a second, barely noticeable. Maestro Aldrin saw it. He leaned forward slightly, curious despite himself. He had spent decades judging performances, and if there was one thing he learned, it was that hesitation could mean many things: fear, uncertainty, or sometimes depth. The audience, however, was not paying attention the way he was. By now, many people were ready to leave. Some were whispering, others scrolling through their phones. A couple had already started putting on their coats. This was normal. By the end of long recitals, attention faded. Lena did not seem bothered by it. She didn't need the room's attention. She didn't crave applause. She only needed to play. Maestro Aldrin tapped his pen on the table gently, as if preparing himself to evaluate her properly. Judges were supposed to remain objective, but even he couldn't deny he was already forming an opinion. He expected a simple piece, maybe a few mistakes, maybe nervous pauses. Nothing remarkable. Lina exhaled softly and finally let her fingers press down on the first keys. But the story of this moment stretches far beyond a single note. It begins earlier that same day, when Maestro Aldrin arrived at the hall. He had entered the building with a stiff walk, carrying his years of experience like a heavy coat around him. He greeted the organizers politely but briefly. He did not believe in wasting time on unnecessary conversation. His mind was focused on the recital, on keeping the standards high. He took his seat early, inspecting the piano as if it were a student being tested. He checked the lighting, the acoustics, the arrangement of the chairs. He believed every detail could shape a performance. He treated each recital with the seriousness of a concert hall. To him, music was not simply a hobby. It was a craft, a discipline, a lifelong commitment. And he believed only those who respected it fully deserved acknowledgement. For most of the evening, his expectations were mostly met. He watched young performers with good, polished technique. Some were confident, others uncertain, but many were well trained. A few surprised him with emotion beyond their age. Still, he was not easily moved. He observed, judged, and wrote. But when the performances reached the later numbers, he noticed something different, something he rarely saw. He noticed fatigue in the audience, distractions, whispers. He disliked when the room lost focus. Music, in his mind, deserved undivided attention. When he saw Lina listed near the end, he almost questioned why the organizers allowed so many performers without regulation. He believed a recital should highlight skill, not clutter the stage with anyone who signed up. Still, he followed the rules. He waited. Now, as Lina sat at the piano and that hesitation touched her fingertips, he felt something stir in the air. He didn't understand it yet, but he sensed that the room had shifted. His pen stilled in his hand. Lina began to play. The first notes were soft, so soft that many people didn't notice immediately. But Maestro Aldrin noticed. He heard the gentleness in her touch, the way the keys responded to her like old friends. There was no stiffness, no uncertainty. Instead, the notes flowed with warmth. He frowned slightly. Not out of irritation, but curiosity. He leaned forward, elbows resting gently on the table. The melody continued, steady, thoughtful, shaped by someone who understood emotion more deeply than technique alone could teach. He found himself listening more intently. He opened his leather notebook, intending to write something, but as the melody changed, he stopped. The shift in her playing was subtle but powerful. The notes carried layers, quiet sorrow, small joys, memories folded within each chord. Maestro Aldrin recognized something rare. This was not the playing of a beginner, nor of someone performing casually. This was the playing of someone who had lived. He felt a strange tightness in his chest, a sensation he had not felt in many years. It wasn't dramatic, just a small ache of recognition. He watched her carefully. Her expression was calm, yet her eyes held something deep, maybe longing, maybe remembering. He could not tell. But he saw that she wasn't simply playing a piece. She was telling a story. And he, a man who had judged countless performers, could feel that story. Meanwhile, the audience slowly fell quieter. Not because someone told them to, but because the music reached them in a way they didn't expect. Whispering faded. The rustling of coats slowed. A few people looked toward the stage, surprised by how the room suddenly felt different. But Maestro Aldrin had already sensed the change long before they did. He removed his glasses and placed them on the table. He didn't blink much as he listened. His attention was fixed entirely on her. He thought back to the note he had written earlier, unknown, possibly inexperienced, and felt a hint of embarrassment. He wasn't used to being wrong. Yet here he was, sitting before a performer who challenged everything he assumed. He didn't know her story yet, but he could feel pieces of it in the way she touched each key. And he found himself wanting to hear more, not just of the music, but of the person playing it. The younger judges beside him noticed the change in his posture. One whispered quietly, "Is she good?" Maestro Aldrin didn't respond. He continued listening. There was a moment, small but unmistakable, when Lena's melody paused delicately, as if taking a breath. That moment struck him deeply. He recognized it not as a mistake, but as intention. She understood silence. Only seasoned musicians knew how powerful silence could be. He rested his fingertips against the edge of the table, his thoughts running deeper than his expression showed. As Lena continued, her music grew richer. Not louder, not faster, just fuller. The emotional weight behind her melody settled into the room like gentle rain. Maestro Aldrin felt something he hadn't felt in years, respect for someone he had underestimated. He glanced down at his notebook again, but this time, instead of phrases like weak tempo or needs improvement, he wrote something else. There is history here. He tapped his pen once, not out of impatience, but reflection. He wondered who she was, why she played the way she did, what she had lived through. He wondered how many stories she carried in those hands. And as he listened, he realized something else. Sometimes talent isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with confidence or shine with polish. Sometimes talent walks quietly into a room unnoticed, carrying a warm music folder and a lifetime of unseen moments. Sometimes true skill reveals itself only when given a chance. As the melody approached another gentle shift, Maestro Aldrin felt a deep certainty forming inside him. Lena was not inexperienced, she was extraordinary, and he was only Meg. The hall felt heavier that morning, as if the tension from the night before had settled into the chairs, the walls, even the floor. The quiet woman sat near the window of her small room, hands wrapped around a cup of warm tea. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the echo of the maestro's voice calling her back, asking for another melody, something he had never done before with anyone else. She didn't know if she should feel proud or frightened. It was strange for her to think that someone like him had noticed someone like her. For years, she had been the person who blended into the background. When she entered a room, no one turned. When she spoke, conversations barely paused. That was her normal, and she had made peace with it. But last night had changed something. She set her empty cup aside and moved to the small table where her old keyboard sat. The paint was chipped around the edges. Several keys were slightly loose from years of use, but it still played. It always had. It had been her companion long before anyone else cared to listen. She rested her fingers on the keys and took a slow breath. But she didn't play anything. Instead, she closed her eyes and tried to quiet her mind. The recital was later today. The maestro wanted her back on the stage, and she wasn't sure what he expected. She wasn't even sure what she expected. All she knew was that she had been given a chance that didn't normally come to people like her chances were, usually reserved for louder voices, younger faces, or people who already shined under the spotlight. But yesterday, her melody had somehow changed things. She finally pressed a single note. It rang out soft and lonely in the room. She didn't begin a song, just played a series of wandering notes. It was her way of warming up, not just her fingers, but her thoughts. She wondered if she should prepare something new for today, but something inside her told her not to overthink it. When she played from her heart, it always felt different, more honest. She didn't want to turn it into something forced. A soft knock came at her door. She turned, surprised. She rarely got visitors. When she opened it, a young woman from the recital staff stood there, holding a small envelope. "This came for you," the staff member said gently. "Delivered early this morning." The quiet woman hesitated before taking it. "Thank you." The staff member smiled politely and walked away. The woman closed the door and returned to her chair, turning the envelope over in her hands. Her name was written on the front in elegant handwriting. She recognized it immediately, the Maestro. Her heart thudded heavily. She carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. He had written only a few lines. "Your music carries truth. Today, play whatever your heart wants to say. Do not play for me. Let the melody speak for you." For a long time, she just sat there staring at the words. The Maestro was known for being strict, proud, and demanding. His comments were almost always sharp, sometimes discouraging. And yet the letter in her hands felt completely different, soft, honest, maybe even hopeful. She read the note again, then pressed it gently between her fingers. Maybe she didn't need to worry so much. Maybe today wasn't about being perfect. Maybe today was simply about letting herself be heard. She folded the letter and placed it in her bag before heading out to prepare for the recital. The walk to the hall felt different from the day before. People hurried past her on the street as they always did, but she didn't feel quite as invisible. She felt present in a way she hadn't in years. The cool air filled her lungs, and she lifted her chin slightly as she walked. She arrived early and found the backstage area almost empty. A few workers set up equipment while another tuned a violin in the corner. One of the workers glanced at her and nodded. "You're the woman the Maestro was asking about," he said with a friendly smile. "He said to send you straight to him when you arrived." She blinked. "He asked for me." "Since early morning," the man replied. "He's in the side room." Her steps felt strangely heavy as she walked toward the room. She knocked softly. "Come in," came the Maestro's voice. She entered. The Maestro stood near a table covered with sheet music. His posture was calm, but his eyes were sharp with focus. Yet when he turned to her, his expression softened. "I'm glad you came," he said. She nodded quietly. He gestured for her to sit. "I wanted to speak with you before the recital begins. Yesterday, your melody." He paused, searching for the right words. "It reminded me of something I had forgotten a long time ago." She waited, unsure if she should say anything. "Music isn't just skill," he continued. "It is emotion, story, memory. You brought all of those things into the hall yesterday. And today, I want you to do the same." She swallowed softly. "I'm not sure people want to hear from someone like me." The Maestro stepped closer, his voice steady but kind. "People want to hear truth, and your music carries it more clearly than most trained performers I've met." She lowered her gaze, overwhelmed by the unexpected praise. "Listen," he said gently. "You do not have to impress anyone today, not even me. Just play honestly. That will be enough." He paused. "More than enough." She nodded, her chest tightening with emotion. "Good." He stepped back. "I will announce you near the end. Rest for now." She stood and bowed her head respectfully before leaving the room. By the time the recital began, the hall was full again. The murmurs of excited conversations rolled gently through the air. She sat backstage, listening to the performers as they took turns on stage. Piano pieces, violins, duets, each one polished, practiced, and confident. She watched them with quiet admiration. Their fingers moved quickly. Their bodies swayed with certainty. They looked like people who belonged on stages. She still wasn't sure she belonged there, but she reminded herself of the Maestro's letter. Her music wasn't about belonging. It was about speaking. And today, she wanted her heart to speak. The performances continued. Then came a brief pause. She heard the Maestro step onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice echoed through the hall. "Before we conclude, I would like to present someone who played yesterday in a way that surprised not only me, but many who heard her. Today, she returns with a melody of her own choosing." The audience grew still. Backstage, her breath trembled. "Please welcome," the Maestro said, "our guest pianist." She froze for a split second. Guest pianist. He hadn't used her name. He didn't need to. The hall was already curious. A stagehand touched her arm lightly. "You're up." She stepped forward, her legs unsteady, her palms warm with nervousness. The lights felt brighter today, almost too bright. As she walked toward the piano, she could feel hundreds of eyes watching her. She reached the bench and sat slowly. Her breath shook as she placed her fingers lightly on the gown. Keys. The hall was silent. She closed her eyes. She didn't think about the audience. She didn't think about the Maestro. She didn't think about yesterday or years of being unseen. She thought about her journey, the quiet moments alone, the small joys, the hidden pain, the many times she almost gave up on herself. And then she began to play. Her hands moved with a softness that grew into strength. The melody rose and fell like a gentle tide. It carried traces of sadness, but also hope. Notes tangled together like memories, some heavy, some warm. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She simply let the song unfold. The audience leaned in, pulled by something they couldn't quite explain. Few people held their breath. Even backstage workers stopped what they were doing. The hall felt suspended in time. When she reached the final note, she let it linger until the air absorbed it completely. Then silence. A deep, full silence. Her hands slowly slipped away from the keys. She didn't dare open her eyes yet. She didn't know what the audience would think. But then the first clap. Then another. Then a wave. The applause rose like a storm building in the distance, before breaking into a roaring sea of sound. She finally opened her eyes. Stunned, the entire hall was on its feet. The Maestro stood closest, clapping with a rare expression of awe on his face. Her breath caught his emotion, swelled in her chest. She had been heard, truly heard, for the first time in her life, and deep inside, something shifted forever. The sound of applause still echoed in her ears, long after she had left the stage. Even backstage, she could feel its vibration, like a warm wave following her through the narrow hallway. She walked slowly, almost cautiously, unsure if she was allowed to believe what had just happened. A standing ovation. For her. For someone who had spent most of her life being overlooked. Quietly moving in the background like a soft shadow. She reached a quiet corner behind the curtain and leaned against the wall, pressing a hand to her chest. Her heart was still racing, but not with fear. This time it beat with something new. Something she had almost forgotten existed. Joy. A deep, trembling joy. She closed her eyes and took a long breath, letting it wash through her. It almost felt like she might cry, but she held it together, not wanting to break apart just yet. A soft sound came from behind her, a footstep. She turned and saw one of the backstage assistants standing nearby. He smiled at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. "That was something special," he said. "People out there are still talking about it." She lowered her gaze shyly. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded and left her alone again, letting her breathe in the quiet. A moment later, she heard another set of footsteps, firmer, steadier. She knew who it was even before she looked. The maestro. He approached slowly, his expression unreadable at first. Then, as he stopped before her, something gentle appeared in his eyes. "You did well," he said simply. She swallowed, unsure how to respond. "I just played what I felt," she said softly. "That is exactly why it worked." He folded his arms loosely. "Your melody was not loud or showy, yet it held everyone in the room. Not many performers can do that. Not many allow themselves to be that honest." She lowered her head, feeling a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "You have a gift," he continued. "You always have. You just needed someone to listen." She exhaled slowly, shaking her head slightly. "I never expected anything like this. Yesterday, I didn't even think I belonged here." The maestro studied her carefully. "Sometimes people convince themselves they belong in the shadows. But talent has a way of finding light, even if it takes years." She looked up at him, surprised by the softness in his tone. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. Her breath caught Dot. No one had said those words to her in a long time. Maybe never in a way that felt so sincere. He stepped aside and gestured toward the hallway. "Come, there are people waiting to meet you." Her eyes widened with panic. "Meet me?" "Yes," he said with a small smile. "You didn't hear them earlier? Several guests asked who you were. They want to speak with you." She felt her stomach twist with nerves. She wasn't used to attention. She wasn't used to people wanting to know her. "I'm not sure I'm ready," she admitted. "You don't need to impress anyone," he said. "Just be yourself. The same person who played on that stage." She hesitated, but his voice had a grounding calmness to it. She finally nodded. "Good," the maestro said. "Let's go." He led her to a small reception area behind the main hall. People were gathered there, speaking in low voices, sipping drinks, and exchanging polite greetings. She lingered near the doorway, unsure how to step forward. But then something happened. A woman near the center of the room looked up and recognized her. Her eyes lit up. "That's her," the woman whispered to the person beside her. Heads turned. Conversations quieted. She froze, her breath tightening again. She felt like a small animal caught in a light. Then one of them approached, a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "I heard your performance," he said softly. "It moved me more than anything I've heard in years." She blinked in surprise, unsure what to say. Another person stepped forward. "Your music had so much meaning. It felt personal. Thank you for sharing it." Then another, and another. Each person spoke with sincerity, offering praise, admiration, and gentle questions. They wanted to know what inspired her. They wanted to know if she performed often. They wanted to know if she would return. She answered quietly, humbly, still overwhelmed by the attention. But slowly, she grew more comfortable. She realized these people weren't here to judge her. They were here because they had felt something real while listening to her music. Eventually, the crowd thinned, and she found a moment to stand alone near a small table. Her hands trembled slightly from all the new feelings swirling inside her. The maestro approached again. "You handled that well." She let out a shaky laugh. "I'm not sure I did." "You did," he said. "Better than you think." She looked at him thoughtfully. "Why did you give me this chance?" He took a breath, then answered with quiet honesty. "Because I've spent years searching for something real in music, something that isn't just skill or perfection, but heart. And last night, when you played, I heard it. You reminded me of why I became a musician in the first place." She felt her eyes warm with emotion. She wasn't used to hearing such words, not from anyone, let alone someone like him. "But," he added, "there is something more." She looked up at him, waiting. "I believe your journey is only beginning," he said. and I want to help you continue it. Her breath caught. Continue? How? There will be more recitals, he explained. More events. More stages. I want you to play in them. Not as a guest. Not as a surprise. But as a true performer. She stared at him, speechless. I know you're used to being unnoticed, the maestro said. But the world needs people like you, people who play with honesty, with humility, with truth. She shook her head slightly, overwhelmed. I don't know if I'm ready for that. I've never performed regularly. I've never trained like the others. The maestro smiled. Then you will learn, and I will teach you. Her lips parted in surprise. You would teach me? If you want it, he said simply. She lowered her gaze, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and excitement. For years, she had quietly wished for a chance to grow, to learn, to be heard. But she had never expected it to come. She took a slow breath. I don't know if I'm good enough. You are, he said firmly. You proved that today. She lifted her eyes, meeting his. There was something steady and sincere in his expression, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe someone believed in her. All right, she whispered. I'll try. The maestro's smile deepened. Good, that is all I ask. She left the recital hall later than she expected. The sky outside had darkened, but the air felt lighter. She walked slowly along the quiet street, replaying the events of the evening in her mind. The applause, the voices praising her, the maestro's offer. She wasn't sure how her life had changed so quickly. But something inside her felt different now, stronger, more open. As she walked, she felt the cool night wind brush gently against her face. She closed her eyes and breathed in, feeling a calm she hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new challenges, maybe even new fears. But for tonight, she let herself feel proud, truly proud. She had played with her heart. She had been seen, and for the first time in her life. She felt like she belonged, not because someone invited her in, but because she had found her own way to the light. She continued walking, her steps steady, her eyes warm. The world felt a little different now, and so did she. The journey back to town was quiet, filled with the weight of the discovery they had just made. The chest was now safely in their hands, but it felt as though it contained more than just objects and letters. It held the essence of a long-forgotten story, a story that had been waiting to be uncovered for decades. The group walked in a slow procession, their steps almost synchronized, as if they were all aware that this moment would change everything. The town of Briar Hill seemed unchanged as they made their way back through the streets. The old buildings, the quiet homes, and the familiar faces all looked the same as they had before the mystery began. But for those who had uncovered the secret of the piano, everything felt different. The weight of the past hung in the air, and the knowledge they carried with them now felt like a thread that connected the present with a forgotten time. When they returned to the hall, they carefully set the chest down in the center of the room. The piano sat in the corner, looking as unassuming as ever, but it was no longer just an old instrument. It was part of a bigger story, and now everyone in the town would know it. As the group gathered around the chest, the historian felt a wave of emotion. She had always been drawn to the past, to the stories that people had left behind, but this was different. This wasn't just an old document or an artifact. It was a piece of the town's soul. The piano, the letters, and the photograph were all part of a deeper connection, a bond that had been lost, but now had been found again. Someone in the group spoke first. We need to share this with the town. Everyone needs to know what we've uncovered. There was a moment of hesitation, as if everyone was thinking the same thing. This was a story that belonged to the whole town, not just the small group who had stumbled upon it. But sharing it also meant revealing something that might change how people saw their town. how they saw themselves. Do you think they'll understand? Someone asked. I don't know, the historian replied. But this is part of our history. It's something that has been hidden for too long. And with that, they made the decision. It was time to tell the story. The group spent the next few days preparing. They wanted to make sure the story was told right. The chest, the letters, and the photograph would be displayed in the town hall for everyone to see. They would invite everyone, families, elders, even the children, to come and learn about the forgotten history that had been buried under layers of time. The piano would remain in its corner, now a symbol of connection between past and present. As the evening approached, the townspeople began to gather. The hall filled with murmurs of curiosity. Some had heard whispers about what had been found, but most of them had no idea what the group was about to reveal. The historian, standing at the front of the room, looked out at the faces in the crowd. She felt a nervousness rise in her chest, but also a sense of pride. This was something important. This was the moment when the story would finally be told. She cleared her throat and began. It started with the discovery of an old piano, she said, her voice steady. An instrument that had been sitting forgotten in the town hall for years. But when we opened it, we found something much more than we expected. Inside, we found a map and a letter that spoke of something much bigger, something tied to the very heart of our town. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, everyone listening intently. We followed the map, and it led us to a place in the hills. There we uncovered a chest. Inside, we found letters, objects, and a photograph that told a story. The story of a family who lived here many years ago, a family whose music had brought people together, and who had hidden something important, something that belonged to everyone in this town. The historian then explained everything they had, discovered the mysterious family, the piano, and the significance of the symbol they had seen everywhere. She spoke of the photograph, the woman and the man who had been part of the family, and how they had left behind a legacy that had been passed down through generations. The townspeople listened in stunned silence. It was a story unlike any they had ever heard before, a story that connected them to a past they had no idea existed. There were whispers, nods of recognition, and a few tears in the crowd. The historian's words had opened a door to something they had never fully understood. We don't know everything, she said as she finished her story. But what we do know is that the piano, the music, and the family were all part of something bigger. They were trying to create a bond, something that would help people understand where they came from. And now it's our turn to carry that legacy forward. The room was still for a moment, as if everyone was absorbing what they had just heard. Then, someone in the back of the room stood up. It was an elderly man, one of the town's oldest residents. I remember, he said, his voice shaky but filled with conviction. I remember the piano. I remember the music. The room fell silent again as the man spoke. He told the crowd about the days when the piano had been played regularly in the town hall, how the music had brought people together. He remembered the family who had once lived here, the family who had been so kind and so full of life. He talked about the piano as if it were a part of his own memories. I was just a boy back then, he continued, but I remember the way it felt when the music filled the room. It was like everything was right in the world. And then, one day, they were gone. Nobody ever knew what happened to them. But I always wondered. He trailed off, his voice heavy with the weight of years. The historian stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. You weren't the only one, she said softly. None of us knew. But now we do. The man nodded slowly, tears in his eyes. I'm glad that the story is finally being told. The crowd was quiet for a moment, each person processing the story in their own way. The historian looked out at the faces in the crowd, and for the first time, She felt a deep connection to them. The mystery that had been buried for so long was no longer just a secret. It was part of their shared history. And then someone in the back raised their hand. What happens now? They asked. The historian smiled, knowing that the answer was simple. Now, she said, we carry the legacy forward. The music, the story, the bond that was created all those years ago. We honor it by remembering and by sharing it with the next generation. As the crowd began to disperse, there was a sense of peace in the air. The mystery had been solved, but it wasn't just the answers that mattered. It was the way the town had come together to uncover the truth. The piano, once forgotten, had now become a symbol of connection, of history, and of the power of music to bring people together. The historian stood in the center of the hall, looking around at the faces of the townspeople. She felt a sense of pride that she had never known before. This wasn't just her story, or the story of the group who had uncovered the mystery. It was the town's story, a story that had been waiting to be told. And with that, the forgotten grand piano, once hidden in the shadows, had finally revealed its secrets. The town of Briar Hill would never be the same again. The mystery had ended, but the legacy would live on forever.